Please join me in welcoming Alex Jung.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'm going to try to make this presentation a little bit more palatable for you because what I'm reviewing today are pending regulations, which aren't necessarily a interesting topic. What we've tried to do, and we've been giving this presentation since the blueprint came out in June, so you'll see that some of the information in here has already started to become a bill in the Senate and in the House, and I'll talk about the updates as recently as this week of how those bills are advancing. And we'll talk a little bit about what the implications are, not just to the value chain, but to employers specifically, and why these are very, very likely to pass. There's a lot of debate over whether or not HHS and CMS have the authority to move forward with these bills. What I can tell you, having spent time in Washington, is that they are not just going through an agency. They're actually making it through Congress, and there have been both closed door and public hearings and public open RFI for comment documents available for the general public to respond to. So this is a very active regulatory agenda. It's not just rhetoric. And I can tell you from having been in these sessions with the doors closed that the language has already been written. It's just being tweaked. So with that, I'm going to go through a summary of what we believe is a pretty well-organized way to look at the regulations because they're pretty lengthy and they obviously are written in legalese. So what we attempted to do as a firm was to translate them into layman's terms so that you can understand their implications. So with that, this is something that came out in May. So it's been going on for a couple of months now, and it was announced by the president. And people always say to me, does Trump really know what he's doing when it comes to health care? The reality is that Trump is not driving this. He's just the mouthpiece for it. It's being driven by two federal agencies, one which is the FDA under Scott Gottlieb, and two CMS HHS under Alex Azar. And for those of you that don't know who Alex Azar is, he's the former CEO of Eli Lilly. He comes from within the industry and absolutely understands how the flow of money works, and he's a veteran of the industry. He has actually taken quite a bit of criticism for attacking some of his former colleagues and his former brethren. So when people ask me about the veracity of his integrity, I can tell you that the man has suffered some pretty public criticism for the stance that he's taken, and there have actually been some threats against him. So he's taking some pretty serious personal risks and sticking his neck out on this issue. What people don't realize is when you go on a public forum, like I do even, you do get threats. There are some crazy people out there who see you as a threat to their livelihood or their job, and they take it very seriously, and not everybody in this country is mentally stable. So I don't think anyone's going to take the risks of putting their neck out there to talk about these topics if they weren't sincere about them. So with that, there are 4 categories of these proposals, and we tried to break them down as much as we possibly could. Now, the one thing that's interesting about this is the reception that it got from the American public and from the investment community, which I find very ironic, and I'll show you some slides at the very end that illustrate how out of touch Wall Street is with the reality of what goes on in the healthcare industry. Very, very few people really understand how healthcare economics work. They may understand how the healthcare value chain works and how service is delivered and what business models look like, but very, very few people follow the numbers. And a lot of that has to do with who's in the industry and how it's being led. Most of the financial information that flows through this industry is confidential for a reason. It is protected because there is so much profiting going on that if the general public really knew what was happening with their premium dollars, there would be a massive uproar. This is but one area of healthcare. It only represents 15 cents on every dollar. And the fact that there's this much controversy over a small component goes to show you what's still in the system. We haven't even begun to talk about the medical side of benefits and what goes on in hospitals and what goes on in provider groups. We haven't even scratched the surface. So think about the rhetoric and the vitriol that has arisen over drug prices. Drug prices, which represent 15% of total healthcare spend. It's going to get worse. This is just the beginning. Because what we live in today that a lot of people dismiss is a transparent society. This didn't happen because some of us took up the mantle and said we need to change the way we pay for care. This happened because we have social media. And people at the ground level started sharing information on the internet and on Facebook and on Twitter, and they started sharing information about what they were actually paying for products. And it created transparency, and questions started getting asked. These are grassroots efforts that drive a lot of what's happening here. And it's just the beginning. So with that, here's what the proposal contains. There are 4 major categories, and some of the language here isn't proper grammar, so you'll have to excuse the English. It was written by congressional aides, and some of the language is like consulting speak. They made up their own words. You'll see when I get there. So there's a couple of things in the outline. The first thing is that there's a theme around this, and this has to do with how incentives work in the system. This is very focused on the incentives in the system. Incentives meaning how money creates influence and how money is being used to drive behavior. The second component of that is the goal of these initiatives and what they're intending to do from an outcome perspective and why they're being categorized the way they are. And then the third component is what's called a mechanism of action. The mechanism of action is actually the way the policy is going to bring about change. Most of the mechanisms of action here are legislative in nature, but they will require fundamental changes in the administrative and operating infrastructure of the industry. Of course, because this is a political environment, there have to be some accomplishments claimed, and you've heard our president talk about how he has pared down price increases from certain drug companies who announced drug increases earlier this year, and how he beat them up and got them to talk to him and agree not to increase their prices. A lot of that's rhetoric. It's a show. Those conversations didn't just happen by accident. All of it was precipitated by conversations that took place way before it made it onto Twitter. And the agencies that are responsible for these directives have been working on this way longer than anybody realizes. Much, much, much more before it ever made it into the newspapers. The work on this started the day they took office, and they came in with an agenda. The reason these people got appointed into these positions was because they came to the president with an agenda. So the categories that they're most interested in are first and foremost increasing competition. There is a wide acceptance of the fact that we have a monopsony in the United States and massive convergence and consolidation, which most of you might think is probably not a bad thing, except that it does one very important thing. It changes the balance of power and the ability of employers to negotiate. When you have a fragmented base on one side and a highly consolidated base on the other, you lose negotiating leverage, which takes power away from you and transfers it to those who are highly organized. That has happened as a matter of business practice. The mergers and acquisitions throughout the last 10 years have resulted in these giant companies on purpose. They're publicly traded companies with boards of directors who are pushing their CEO to create as much scale as possible to protect existing revenue streams for the benefit of their shareholders. And they had to converge in order to control and protect their negotiating leverage through scale. The employer community, on the other hand, can't do that. The best you can do is organize through coalitions. And to be quite frank, and those of you who've heard me speak on this before, I can tell you you've been very sloppy and unorganized about it. So you have abdicated a significant amount of your power in negotiating leverage to these massive corporations, and now you lament the fact that you can't change anything. The second part of this has to do with bettering negotiations. That's that consulting speak. There's no such word as bettering. It's called improving. Anyway, I took a little issue with it when I saw it, but it's actually focused on Part D. So the other thing that people tell me is that this has nothing to do with employer-sponsored health care and it won't affect plans that are not government plans, and that's not true, and you'll see why. This absolutely impacts self-insured employers. They start with Medicare Part D. What you haven't seen yet is the rest of the language. In that competition phase, by the way, I forgot to mention that this has to do with generics and the fact that biosimilars are having a difficult time entering the market to create necessary competition for branded products, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The third piece is lowering list prices. Now, here's an interesting topic, the topic of price and what it is defined by. There's lots of definitions for a drug price. There are lots of benchmarks for a drug price. There's a big difference between a net price, a list price, and a wholesale price. And there are lots of incentives that influence final price. or the paid value that's adjudicated at the point of sale. So the word price, what you don't see and what isn't public, is how it's been defined, and the myriad of definitions that have been documented by law school students that are interns in the Washington White House. They've chronicled dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of the word price, how it's calculated, what it means, and how it's derived. What they're trying to do here is to ensure that discounts and rebates are passed along to intended patients, and I'll come back to why in a minute. There's lots of debate by the PBMs around whether or not they're passing on these rebates today. Doesn't matter whether you are or you aren't, unless you're doing it consistently at 100% of the rate, 100% of the time, there's a problem. Even if only 5% of employers don't get all their rebates, that's a problem. Even if it's not in their contract, that's a problem. That money wasn't intended to be used as profit. The intent of those incentives was to help patients pay for their drug. And we'll come back to this because it's a very contentious topic. Some drug companies are actually defending the PBM practices, which I find fascinating because this is money that they're actually giving the PBM. And then lastly, lowering out-of-pocket costs. Now, this topic ought to be very important to you. And this has to do with affordability. We have a massive problem in the United States where there is a big disconnect between the average employer's plan design and the average employee's salary, and whether or not they can actually afford their health care. It has caused a massive problem in the United States where it is driving bankruptcies, poverty, wage inflation, or wage deflation, I should say, wage compression. And there is a massive movement to, at some point, address high deductible plans. It's not quite in this bill yet, but it's coming. And it has to do with the transfer of risk to the average American and how that's driving impact to the economy and people's ability to spend because there's no disposable income available. So with that, let's go to the first one, increasing competition. And this has to do with generics and biosimilars. For the last 15, 20 years, we have been pushing a generic conversion or generic substitution agenda in the United States, and we have a very, very efficient use of generics in this country as compared to other countries in the world. In Europe, the rate's very low. It's like 40%. The United States, we're creeping up in about close to 75 to 80% use of generics. We have a very efficient use of low-cost pharmaceutical products in this country, and no one ever admits that. 80% are generics. Now let's step back and take a look at that for a second, because what does that mean? Most formularies include a requirement that a generic, if it's available, it has a lower price, be substituted at the point of sale if it's not written as dispenses written. The price of the average generic in this country is pretty low. It's about $10 a month. That's a very efficient price for drugs, and we don't give credit where credit is due. We have done a phenomenal job in this country of keeping drug prices low. There are 10,000 licensed products in the United States. About 200 of them are the most commonly used, and they represent 80% of prescriptions. And those drugs can be purchased for less than $10 a month. So when we talk about high drug prices, please keep in mind that you're talking about outliers. High drug prices do not apply to the general average at all. In fact, we have a very, very inexpensive system in the US. So with that, there is another problem because we still have lots of branded products out there that could be generics, that are in the specialty category, that could be what are called biosimilars. The problem with biosimilars are twofold. One, the price point, and two, there isn't generalized acceptance of them yet. So they're not making it into the market because there are some practices that are being perpetuated by certain drug companies that are preventing their introduction by the generics manufacturer. They play games with the what is called the loss of exclusivity or the patent expiration. They play games with when they will actually hand over the formulation or allow for the conversion to the generic product. There's this window of 180 days after the patent expires in which they are, in most cases, supposed to transfer that formulation over to a generics manufacturer, and that gets delayed. In fact, some drug companies will actually pay for the delay so that they can protect market share for their branded product for as long as possible. Well, that's fine. If the average American wants to pay for it, and if your plan wants to pay for it, that's fine. The reality is what it has done is it's actually stifled the introduction of biosimilar generics in the market, which are significantly lower price against a specialty brand. So what Congress wants to do, and I say Congress intentionally because I'm going to come back to how they're involved now, is to take a look at all of the drugs that were in the pipeline in the FDA that were awaiting approval because there was a backlog. So part of the problem was a backlog in the FDA and getting approvals for those products. And they ended up literally throwing money at the FDA agency and letting them hire more people to expedite the approval process. And in 2017, there was massive approval rates. I mean, they were doing this like crazy, hundreds of drugs a month, and it flooded the market with approvals. And there's still a backlog. There was a 5-year backlog on approvals, and they're still catching up. There's also what they're calling the Drug Competition Act, or the Drug Competition Action Plan. It's not an act, it's a plan, to try and improve the process and close some of those loopholes that branded manufacturers are using to delay the introduction of generics. They're also looking at ending this indefinite 180-day exclusivity extension. So there are ways that a drug company can file an extension to keep their exclusivity beyond the 180-day period. The FDA wants to stop that process. And they also want to be able to identify biosimilars with their own code. So there is a movement to create a code in the Medicare Part D billing taxonomy that can identify those biosimilars independently of other products so that they can be split out on the bill, especially in Part B where they're bundled into the hospital bill. Sometimes they are not individually identified because they are bundled into what's called a unibill. So HHS wants to be able to see the actual price of the drug, and I'll come back to why later. So the directives there are also going to include what's called risk mitigation strategies, REMS. These are programs that are used by drug companies to evaluate risk of a product, and some of those processes are actually used to delay or block the introduction of a generic by a competitor. And then obviously education. So a lot of this has to do with improving the speed at which generics get introduced into the market so that we can reduce the amount of money that's being paid to high-priced brands. Remember, high-priced brands, however, make up less than 20% of all drugs prescribed. And when we talk about high-cost specialty drugs, those that go over $50,000 a year, those are outliers. You can count them on one hand. There are 10,000 products out there. And all the articles you read about are about 5 products. The discussion in this country is focused on 5 things, when it ought to be focused on the broader discussion around what we have on our formularies and whether or not we should even have formularies or whether or not we should even be paying for some of this stuff. And what they're trying to do with this particular provision is to encourage generic competition. But for those products that are recently introduced as specialty products, there is no generic competition. Patent laws exist for a reason. So I'm going to flip the coin a second and talk about the fact that drug companies spend on average $1 to $2.5 billion of investor capital, because they're publicly traded companies, to do research and development on these breakthroughs. They have to make up that cost somewhere. They're publicly traded companies. And until and unless we as a country turn the process of research and development into a tax-funded national agency, we have no choice but to pay for it through publicly traded capital. And those organizations have a profit mandate, not a motive, a mandate. They have to make up this investment. What I tell audiences all the time is be careful not to demonize this process. It will result in less and less innovation, less and less experimentation, and less discovery. And if any of you have spent any time outside of the United States, you know how dangerous this is becoming already. Nobody is researching antibiotics right now. It's a massive global problem. We have antibiotic-resistant viruses. We don't have antivirals for them. Why? Because these companies have a profit motive and a profit mandate. to go after things that are profitable. And until we change the national dialogue about what's important to us from a disease criteria perspective, that's not going to change. But demonizing the researchers is not the way to go. What we need to have is a constructive dialogue about which diseases we need to prioritize. The second component has to do with this bettering negotiations. And this has to do with Part D. They're specifically going after Part D because that's what they can attack first. Trust me when I tell you there's other language pending that will eventually get to employer plan sponsors, self-employed or self-insured employer plan sponsors. So in this particular provision, what they're looking at is demonstration projects. So those of you that are familiar with Medicaid, Medicare, Medicaid too, they use block grants to fund demonstration projects. CMMI, which is a component of the agency, will give block grants to community-based healthcare providers to run demonstration projects to see whether or not they can demonstrate better outcomes for different ways of doing things. So there's some money being appropriated, and there's a directive under CMS to develop what are called value-based care models. And this has to do value-based. When you hear the word value-based or outcomes-based, what that means is risk sharing. It's about a collective sharing risk. Everyone thinks it's about paying for outcomes or paying for value and demonstrating this outcome that a reimbursement is made up against. It's not. These are tiered risk-sharing agreements where all parties take a portion of the dollars coming in and they share the risk. These are fancy words for nothing more than risk transfer. Now, Medicare Part D also wants to look at updating their benefit design and their use of a formulary to address these mid-year or non-annual price increases. Now, a drug company can take a price increase at any time. What Medicare wants to do is lock in the price for the entire year. They want drug prices to provide them a price and lock it in for 12 months so that there's no fluctuation in the federal budget that funds HHS, and to keep those prices stable for beneficiaries. The drug companies are pushing back on that because their drug price is based on volume, and their discounts are based on volume, so they would have to assume some risk and do some future projections of that risk in order to be able to create a price point that will take into account fluctuations in volume. That might mean that the drug company might set the price high at the beginning of the year to make up for the fact that they might have a loss later on. That's what happens when you fix a price. You do, in many cases, have to take a higher price up front in order for the other party to provide you with a stable price. That's true of any product. That's just economics 101. So the other issue, there's this flexibility to negotiate. Medicare doesn't have the ability to negotiate drugs for Part B and Part D collectively. So what they're looking at there, and you'll see a couple of other references to this, they want to bundle the products between Part B and Part D and negotiate them at the same time. So if they're buying a product from Merck on Part B at one price and Part D at another price, they want to be able to combine that volume and get the same price frozen for the year. And what they want to do with that is also look at the formularies and determine which of those drugs, which drug companies are willing to give them a fixed price, which of those drugs will actually be on formulary as reimbursable. This is creating a massive debate with them and the drug companies over how pricing works. That's why there's all this conversation going on about price increases. It's because of this. So when the CEO of Pfizer has a conversation with the president about not raising prices, they knew this was coming. They did it to provoke a national dialogue. And the dialogue is occurring behind closed doors. So the other issue is this competitive acquisition program. That's basically taking an RFP that would be sent out by Part B and combining it with an RFP that would be sent out for Part D. Now this doesn't affect employers. Sorry guys, I keep hitting the microphone because I'm a Greek and I keep using my hands. I gotta sit on them. But what they want to do is combine those RFPs and, again, do one bulk purchase because they believe, and they probably are right, with the volume combined, they'd get a better price. There are some other policies in here. So there's this one bullet, 3 bullets from the bottom, that has to do with global freeloading. What I said earlier about research and development, what I didn't point out there is that all of it's done in the United States. We fund it as an American society. European countries don't pay anything for R&D, neither do countries in Africa or in Asia. But they get lower prices because when a drug company leaves the United States and has to do business in a country in Europe, they have to do what's called a tender, which is an RFP where they bid a price on their product and it has to be accepted by that government. They must bid what's called best price, the lowest price possible, in order to get permission by that country to sell their product in that country. So they go to Germany, and Germany says, we want best price. Of course the prices in those countries are lower than they are in the United States, because in order for someone to compete in that country, they have to give them what the government requires. So they go to Canada, they do the same thing, because these are all nationalized healthcare systems. Everywhere in the world has a national healthcare system with the exception of us and Papua New Guinea. The United States is one of the biggest outliers internationally, with regards to not having a national healthcare system. We don't have negotiating leverage like the other countries do. We pay more because we aren't a collective. We don't negotiate the same way, but we also don't force other countries to take on their fair share of R&D dollars. In the trade war, I'm going to regress for a second and tell you what's really going on with these trade wars, because I've actually been involved in some of this as well. These trade wars aren't about the price of cars. They're about the international burden on the investment that's made in this country through American capital for innovation. The trade war has nothing to do with current products on the market. It has to do with the international burden of the capital invested by Americans and American companies in innovation, so that we can create patented, trademarked, copywritten, protected products. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you believe that the products that are being sold in some of these international markets where we want to import them because they're lower price have the same quality as what is manufactured here? No, they don't. The United Nations, a very independent group to the pharmaceutical industry, actually conducted a study, and they found that 11% of the products manufactured outside the United States were counterfeit. I've seen some of these plants. I travel all over the world. I can tell you their manufacturing quality is not the same. The FDA, as much as we criticize them, does a phenomenal job of protecting American patient safety. Phenomenal job in comparison to other countries. So when we talk about importation, when I talk to people who argue with me about importing drugs, I look at them and I go, come with me to these other countries one day, just one day. I want to show you something, because I've seen it with my own eyes. I wouldn't trust that one in every 10 pills that I may be prescribed isn't a pill. It's a placebo or a sugar pill, or it's made of such poor quality that it melts in my hand, or there's no enteric coating on it because we had to make it for pennies on the dollar. The guidelines for manufacturing are such that you don't have to have 100% of the active ingredient in the product. In fact, you can go as low as 40% and still hit the requirements for formulation, because the formulation of the active ingredient allows the manufacturer to go as low as 40 and as high as 120 on the active ingredient. You don't have to have an enteric coating. An enteric coating is what coats the pill to keep it together so that your body can metabolize it and the acid in your stomach doesn't break it up so much that you just, pee it out. So this stuff is important, because if you're not a biologist or a scientist, you don't understand this. You think this is a commodity that you can just purchase. But let me ask you another question. We can't protect the Louis Vuitton and the Hello Kitty brand on the international level. What makes you think we're going to be able to protect the integrity of a statin? That's an honest question, guys. These are massive corporations with lots of money. The Louis Vuitton company. Think about who I'm talking about right now. This is an international conglomerate that burns their merchandise to keep their prices up. They cannot protect their brand from manufacturing integrity issues on a global level. What makes us think that importing these products is a good thing for the average American? So stop having that argument unless you do your homework. Now, the argument you ought to be having is whether or not these countries ought to pick up the burden for the research and innovation in the first place, because they're not paying a nickel for it. They're freeloading. So that's what President Trump's been talking about, and he's right. Can't believe I said that. Gotta put this back on there before I break it again. So the other thing to keep in mind on this importation issue is what's happening in foreign countries. This wasn't an accident, the way this was included in the proposals here. Certain countries, certain countries I have visited just recently, are changing what they call their intellectual property rules. Those two countries happen to be China and India. Why? Because they have over 1.5 billion people in them, and they know they have a looming healthcare crisis. So what they're trying to do is encourage capital transfer from the United States into their countries of biotechnology companies. They want drug companies to come to them. And they're offering massive incentives for this to happen, and especially China. This debate with China around intellectual property is 100% based on what's happening in the drug industry. It's not in the newspapers, but that's what's driving it. Why? Because China just issued massive reforms around intellectual property in their country and how they would protect biotechnology firms. Now remember who these drug companies are. Most of them are not American companies, guys. They're not headquartered in the United States. They have no obligation to stay here. In fact, most of them are headquartered in Europe, and they're being wooed to come to China. And China's saying to them, we'll build you a biopark. You don't have to pay for it. In fact, we'll pay for the research. We'll give you 100,000 biologists, because we got plenty of people and resources. Come here. Bring your biotech farms here and manufacture for us. Now, if you're a publicly traded company that's headquartered in the United Kingdom, you're looking at this and going, the US, China. Here I have to pay. There, they're going to do it for me. What am I getting in the US? Lots of headaches. What do I get in China? 1.5 billion people for my product. Be careful how we demonize these drug companies. They're publicly traded, and until we want to have a debate, once again, about making this a system that is nationalized and protected, we cannot tell them what to do. The next component has to do with how they set their price. Now, these list prices, as I said earlier, have to do with the costs of this R&D and how they recoup it over time. So when a drug company sets their price, they actually look at what they invested in research and development over the life cycle of their clinical trials, and they have more than one. They may have 10 products in the pipeline and only one actually hits. They can't just write off a loss for the 8 or 9 that failed. They'd go bankrupt. So they have to take all of those capital expenses and roll them into the price of the drug that did succeed. So you're not paying for the development of that one drug. You're paying for the failures of the other 8 that didn't make it. The price of your products include the cost of failure. Someone has to pay for it. We forget that. So what they're talking about here is changing the way we price drugs. And in doing so, they want to see all the incentives that are part of that price, because they know that the drug companies are also in many ways being held hostage on price by third parties, whether those third parties are wholesalers or pharmacy benefit managers. We've created this practice in the United States where we use what are called rebates to get placement on formulary for market access, and it has become a chicken and egg game where both sides are arguing that none of this is really going on, but the evidence does prove that it is. And if the evidence wasn't there, I don't think the administration would be proposing a bill to Congress for it. So there is a couple of things that they're looking at. One is the inclusion of this list price in direct-to-consumer advertising. So there's lots of commercials on TV, but no one actually knows what the price of the product is. The drug companies are actually comfortable sharing the list price. They don't have a problem publishing it. They don't have a problem telling the consumer that this price is $100 for this product. The problem they have is that they can't do it because they're gagged in their contract with their third-party suppliers, whether it's distribution companies like wholesalers or PBMs. They can't talk about the list price because what happens to that list price is it gets manipulated in the value chain and it's increased over time. They also can't talk about the rebates that they give these organizations or the discounts. Now, PBMs argue with me all the time. We pass those rebates on. It's not all of the incentives that you get. There is way more than a rebate in the incentive package from a drug company. And the employers don't know what they've got because there's a gag order in that clause. They can't tell you, or a gag clause in that contract. They can't tell you what's in their contract between the drug company and them. They don't want to tell you because they want you to pay the price they're giving you. Now, I've had this debate about rebates with every PBM in the country, and I keep telling them that's a deflection strategy. You're talking about one component of incentives. I'm talking about the appropriate use of premiums. So let's get that argument accurate. This isn't about what you get in rebates or what you get in fees or what you get paid for your service. This is about whether or not those dollars should have been used for that purpose. That's all it is. Should those dollars have been used for that purpose? Or should they have been used for the purpose of buying a product that would benefit a patient? Could we have bought 2 drugs instead of 1? Could we have saved the lives of 2 patients instead of 1? Had we been efficiently using the dollars in the system? I believe it's waste. There's profit there. How much profit is appropriate? Now, again, they're publicly traded companies. They're entitled to make whatever profit they want. But HHS is saying, we want to know what those list prices are so that when we do get that price from the payer, we can compare. What did the drug company set the list price at, and what are we paying for it as a consumer? That would automatically collapse all incentives in the system. We would immediately go to what is called a net price. Because you can't have 2 prices. The consumer environment would completely freak out. They're not going to pay a cash price or an insurance price when the manufacturer is publicly telling them what their list price is. So what they're looking at here is also creating what's called a price dashboard so that consumers can compare. So I talked about cash price versus insurance price. There's a big difference as well between the price paid at the pharmacy if the patient has insurance versus if they were to pay cash. And they're pretty significant differences. But the pharmacists also have gag clauses in their contracts between them and the PBM, and they can't tell the patient that the cash price is lower. So let's get to what happened this week. There are 2 bills going through Congress, one which is a House bill and the other one which is a Senate bill. And there was an announcement on the 7th of September that both bills have passed, and now they're being reconciled into a single bill, which will go to the president for signature. That bill contains language in it that the pharmacist and the pharmacy no longer can have a gag clause in their contract. That is a massive change to this industry, because now you've empowered every pharmacist in the country to be able to expose the actual price of the drug to the patient at the point of sale. They see it on their computer. They know exactly what the price was, how it was changed, and what the insurance company would pay if it was a PBM. I'm using the term insurance company to mean PBM, and what the cash price would be if they paid cash. So the pharmacist can say, hey, of all the prices in here, if you paid cash, it's only $10. Guess what happens when the average American pays cash? There's no claim. There's nothing to adjudicate. They give me $10, I give them their drug, they go away. You don't know what they just took or what they just bought. But you put them in a high deductible plan. You transferred the risk to them. You said, we want you to pick up $3,000 of your care. Well, okay, fine. I'll pay out of pocket. You don't know what drugs I'm on now. There are trade-offs for everything we do in this business. Be careful what you ask for, because now we've created an environment where you're not going to know what drugs your employees are on. There's no claim. In fact, we are already today, and you probably don't even know this because you don't see it, 40% of drugs purchased at the counter are paid for in cash. You already are missing 40% of the data on your employees today without any of this. You just don't realize it. Why? Because they can go to Walmart and get a generic for $4 a month. They can go to Walgreens and get that same generic for $9.99 for a 90-day supply. Doctor prescribed a drug, they went to Walgreens, they got it for $10, they paid cash. You have no idea that your employees are on that product anymore because there's no claim record. You don't know if they're adherent, you don't know if they're compliant, because you didn't pay for it. That's what we're talking about here. The other thing that they're looking at is evaluating what is called the Affordable Care Act maximum rebate amount. And this has to do with the amount the drug company can actually rebate back to the PBM. They want to evaluate whether or not the practice of rebates should be eliminated altogether. Now, think about what I just said. This bill that was in the House and in the Senate is being reconciled into a single bill that will go to the president for signature. Becomes law. Removing the gag clause between the pharmacist and the PBM is the single most powerful lever this administration could have used to reform the industry. Even if they do nothing else, they created immediate transparency around drug price. Immediate. This has massive ripple effects. So when people say to me, this isn't going to happen, it's not going to pass, no, it's already happened, already passed. So do you guys know what the OIG is, the Office of the Inspector General? You know what they do? Anybody know what they do? They're an investigative agency. You know what the CBO is, the Congressional Budget Office? They're a fiscal agency. It's their responsibility to look at the costs of something. They're both bipartisan agencies. They're not Republican or Democrat. They are by law required to be bipartisan. Both of these agencies have evaluated the provisions in these bills and found them to be sound and are supportive. They're so supportive that they've actually submitted a budget request to the Appropriations Committee of Congress. The Appropriations Committee is the committee of Congress that decides how much money to give to an agency to execute on its mandate. This has already happened, folks. So if you're not paying attention to what's going on in your legislative environment, time to start listening, because it's a massive change, and it is moving forward. Now, the other thing that's happening here is another provision of price, which gets a lot of criticism and is probably not on your radar, but you probably don't realize you're paying for it, and that has to do with 340B. 340B is a program that was instituted actually many years ago. It's been around for decades, but up until recently hadn't been used in the way it's been used. And that has to do with how hospital pharmacies can actually purchase drugs and at what price. They used to be able to get it at a significantly lower price than any other purchaser in the market. And what they were doing is they were using what is called price spreading. It's kind of what PBMs do with price. They price spread. And they keep the difference between what they purchased the drug at and what they resold the drug at. That becomes a profit to them. And for the most part, the federal government allowed them to do this because it was helping hospitals that were community-based or safety net hospitals make up some of their losses because of low Medicaid reimbursement, where they might be on the verge of bankruptcy. So they were allowing them to keep some of this profit, but what started happening was these big academic medical centers, which were not unprofitable, academic medical centers have billions of dollars of endowment. They're not poor. But they were like, hey, we're hospitals too. We qualify to be able to be in this program, so we'll start a 340B hospital pharmacy. We'll do the same thing and we'll keep those profits. Well, the government got wind of this and said, what are you guys doing with all this money? Well, some of them did some stupid things like pay bonuses to their CEO. That's not what the money was meant for. It was supposed to be earmarked for vulnerable populations, which means people on Medicaid or dual eligibles. And they were supposed to be serving in a minimum 11% of their book of business had to be vulnerable populations in order to even qualify. So you had a whole bunch of organizations out there that weren't meeting the qualification standards, that were precipitating 340B prescriptions, keeping the profit, building buildings, paying their CEO. So the abuses got so bad that the federal government intervened, started investigating. The OIG comes in, starts doing investigations, and realized this thing's out of control. So one of the provisions here is to stop the growth of the program, change the eligibility criteria because they believe it's too broad, and stop what is called the duplicate discounting, because they get this Medicaid block grant and a drug rebate, plus they get the 340B spread pricing. So there's a whole bunch of gamesmanship going on with hospitals too. Not just PBMs that are bad actors in this. It's not just drug companies that are bad actors in this. It's hospitals too. And we don't talk about them, but they're perpetuating it just as badly because we have used the drug industry as a means to make money. And there's lots of profit in it. And who suffers from this? The average American. One of my good friends, Dr. Bruce Sherman at Wake Forest University, did a study on income inequality in the United States, totally unrelated to healthcare. He's just a researcher. And he found that 40% of working Americans make less than $40,000 a year. I love this because it's 444. 40% of Americans make less than $40,000 a year. 40% of Americans have less than $400 in the bank. This was published in the newspapers. It was in the Wall Street Journal. It was in the USA Today. It was national headlines. If you didn't read it, shame on you. Shame on you, really. Because these are people who work for you. They have $400 in the bank, and we are giving them $3,000 deductibles to pay for drugs that cost thousands of dollars And then we want control over everything they do. And we don't like the fact that they're going to pay cash because we now no longer know what prescriptions they've been given and what they bought at Walgreens. What you're going to pay for, it's none of your damn business. The American public has been disadvantaged for too long, and social media is their friend. And all of this started because of a grassroots effort by a woman who was paying for her medication out of pocket at a CVS and discovered that she had overpaid out of her own pocket $15,000 a year for a product that she could have gotten significantly less expensively, and she stopped therapy. Of course, it was a cancer drug. So she sued her employer, and she sued CVS, and it has made it to a federal court, has not been adjudicated by the judicial system yet, but this is where it's headed. So if we think about what's actually happening here and who is paying the price for all of these games, it's your employees, folks. It's the average American patient who is sick. They take medication for a reason. Nobody wants to take drugs. So what HHS is trying to do here is improve transparency of these prices and these rebate practices and where these dollars go, because guess where they come from in the first place? Where'd the money come from? Premiums, right? And where'd the premiums come from? People's payroll deductions. So we are in effect perpetuating poverty by taking money out of people's paychecks to pay for health care and using it ineffectively and inefficiently to help companies profit while we bankrupt the average American. We have wage stagnation in this country, not because of economic policy, but because of healthcare policy. And there's finally studies out there that are proving it. So what HHS would like to do is, at least for where they have authority on Medicare Part D, they would like to prohibit plans from using these gag clauses to prohibit pharmacists from telling employees or Medicare beneficiaries that there's a cheaper alternative. This is the bill that's been passed. And then require Part D plan sponsors to provide more information about those increases. They're going to require MA PDP plans, Medicare Advantage PDP plans, to proactively educate people on drug pricing and alternatives for patients. That's about as far as they can go, but this is what's interesting, and this is what's still open for public comment. They also want, they've sent out an RFI and they've asked for public commentary around whether or not there should be an end-of-year statement that's issued to the federal government by all parties that they negotiate with that disclose what rebates were actually collected and paid. They want a federal preemption of these gag clauses, and that includes employers who are self-funded and fully insured. So this is the provision that hasn't yet passed. It's open for comment. And then increasing information around cost sharing, because Medicare's got that donut hole, remember? So they also have the same burden as people on high deductible plans. And senior citizens on average make $1,200 a month from Social Security, and 75% of them live on only Social Security. So you have a situation where we have poverty level in Social Security already. In the meantime, we've got all these large corporations with CEOs that walk away with $100 million compensation packages. Is it fair? So what happened when these things were announced? Wall Street thought it was great. They started buying up stock in the companies that were being attacked. This is how out of touch the average Wall Street analyst is, guys. They thought this was a good thing for PBMs and insurance companies. These are investors. This is how bright they are. This was May. I don't have the chart that shows today, but it went like this. And then they went, oh, like that. Sorry, we didn't read the detail. Why? Because the average American doesn't pay attention to details. No one wants to do their homework anymore. They don't want to understand these things. Now, you guys came today because you were curious. You came to this session because you wanted to learn. You wanted to be educated. How many of you are out there that don't know and don't care? Because this is where we get our news. We rely on all of this to tell us what to believe. And a lot of Americans didn't even understand what Trump was trying to do. Now, I'm not up here to defend Trump. Believe me, I'm not up here to defend the president. What I am up here to talk about is whether or not these practices are appropriate use of patient money. I'm going to say it again, whether or not the current model makes appropriate use of people's money. That is what I'm questioning. And you can also see that a lot of people didn't think there were enough specifics in the plan. But when they were polled and asked if they actually read the legislation, less than 1% had actually read the bill. Less than 1% actually downloaded the language, which is publicly available, by the way. This is a government agency. You can pull it down and read it. It's not that bad. The Affordable Care Act was 1,600 pages of legislation. This is not 1,600 pages. There's a 40-page summary you can read for yourself. There's an open commentary RFI out there, so if you'd like to leave comments for Congress, and I completely urge you to be active participants in our political system, because too many of us are passive and don't pay attention to what's going on. There's an open commentary period that goes through the end of September on some of the provisions that will affect self-insured employers, so you should be paying attention. And if you haven't already talked about this as a coalition, your coalition is your best resource for coming to the table with a collective voice. I do these pro bono. This is not my day job. I'm an accountant. I don't do this for a living at all. I do this because it's a personal passion, and I come to these coalition meetings to talk to audiences like yours because I was in the industry for a very long time, and I watched the passivity and what I believed was almost like a paralysis from the employer community about doing anything different. And I come from a generation where employers were being innovative. They were introducing all kinds of cool things in healthcare. And I go back to the 80s. I haven't seen that in the last 10 years, and I don't know what happened. So I would leave you with these parting words. If you don't do it, someone's gonna make you do it because it's your fiduciary duty. And you may have heard me speak about this term fiduciary in the past. You have a duty as an employer. You don't just get to take people's money out of their paycheck and use it at your discretion without being held accountable. And some states are actually coming forward and asking who should be this fiduciary. The employers are saying, it's the PBM. Okay, well, some states have said, we will legislate that. We will make the PBM a fiduciary. Some states have said, no, we'll make the employer the fiduciary. Now, do you really want this to continue? Do you want all 50 states to have different rules? Because guess what? If you're a national company, you're going to have to comply with all 50 of them. So you best get on board with a national agenda, or the states will do it for you because they have Medicaid plans that they're trying to protect, and that's why they're legislating this, because their Medicaid programs are in PBM programs. And they're an employer too. In fact, some of the states are actually suing PBMs for their practices. They're suing drug companies. Have you guys heard of the Rockford lawsuit in Rockford, Illinois, against the opioid manufacturers? Because they paid so much money in opioids. We don't make change in this country because of changes in the law. We make change in this country because of what a courtroom says. We don't want it to go there because you will be dragged into it. And CFOs and HR executives are denying that they have any responsibility here. They're like, it's not our problem. And I don't know if you guys know David Chase, but he's also pretty controversial. He's written a bunch of books on healthcare reform. I actually really, really respect Dave because he does his homework. And what he's saying here is that this is a dereliction of duties. Now, you may dismiss his article, but guess what? Do you guys know what a law firm is? If you're a plaintiff attorney, you see this and you go, woohoo, I got a class action lawsuit. Hey, the tobacco industry was great. I'm going to take on the employer's plan sponsors because guess what? They haven't done jack in 10 years, maybe 20. This is awesome. These are big corporations I can go after. They have deep pockets. And guess who they're going to ask for subpoena? The benefit directors, because you're the gatekeepers. So don't look at me like I'm the bad messenger here. I'm just delivering a presentation, and I hope that you take what I've said to heart. Work with your coalitions. Come together in a common collective voice. Stand together as an organized group of employers and stop abdicating your power to the corporations. They're using you, and they're using your employees' money. And you have a bigger responsibility with fiduciary duty. So thank you for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today.
Thank you, Alex. We have time for a few questions. Please make your way to the microphones there and there to ask your questions.
What are 2 or 3 or 4 things that we can do to start? First of all, you got to get educated. You got to find out what's in this bill. This is a good resource, but it's not the only resource. Read it. Ask questions. If you have an ERISA attorney, talk to them. Talk to your own general counsel about what your liability might be here. You got to start with your homework. That's the first thing. The second thing is talk to each other. As I said before, I'm going to put a plug in for the coalitions because they're here as a resource to you. And I've seen the membership dwindle year after year after year, and it's counterintuitive to me. At a time when you guys should be working together, you're more further apart. You have resources available to you to help you create collective responses. The second thing you ought to be doing is not only leveraging those resources, but working with them to evaluate what the pending regulations are and preparing responses to the open RFIs. This is a public discourse with a federal agency. You have the opportunity and the obligation to be a voice of your employees. Have an opinion on it, come to consensus, and respond, or they will change the legislation and you will be victims of it. The third thing you can do is talk to your vendors or your partners and ask them what they're doing to prepare and how they're going to help you prepare. You pay them to serve you, not the other way around. I can't tell you how many employers tell me they're afraid of their PBMs. That's ridiculous. It is ridiculous to me that you're afraid of someone you pay for a service, or you're afraid of your consultants. God, I wish my clients were afraid of me. They beat the crap out of me. But I'm an accountant. It's a whole different, they don't want to hear what I have to say. But you have resources available to you. If you're spending your time worrying about day-to-day operations, you're not doing your job. This stuff is too important for you not to be paying attention. You will lose your job if you don't pay attention to it. It is the single largest piece of legislation we've seen since the Affordable Care Act. And that was 10 years ago. And it's just beginning. As I said, this is just drugs. Wait till they get to the hospitals. It's only going to get harder for you if you're not on top of it and in front of it. So those 3 things are my piece of advice. Do your homework, work with your coalition partners and each other, and talk to your vendors and come up with a game plan. You guys have got to do something beyond transferring risk to your employees and increasing deductibles year after year after year. They can't afford them. So you got to do something different.